here just to let
Yep.
it. So hello, everyone. This is Shannan Vance-Ocampo. My pronouns are she and her, and I serve as the General Presbyter for the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this is Connecting Our Conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. And today I am talking to the Reverend Bruce Reyes-Chow, who's a Presbyterian minister all the way over in California on the other coast, uh, and former moderator of the PCUSA General Assembly. Bruce has served in a number of different pastoral capacities. We'll hear more about that in a few minutes, and is the author of 7 books, the latest of which is what we're going to be talking about today. Everything Good About God is True. Choosing Faith, which is officially, I think, Bruce launched this week. Is this the official launch week?
Yes, tomorrow, the day after we're
Tomorrow.
recording. Yes, very excited.
Okay, great. So we're recording on Monday. You're going to launch Tuesday, and then this is going to go out into the world on Wednesday. So perfectly timed. And Bruce and I have known each other for a long time through years of intersecting work around some social justice issues, mostly in the areas of immigration, also LGBTQIA rights in the church, and fossil fuel divestment and the climate crisis. So Bruce, it's great to see you. Welcome to Connecting Our Conversations. And I look
So,
forward to having a deep dive into the book.
yeah,
Uh,
glad to be here. We're
yeah,
getting old.
I know. I know. I turned 40 7 years ago, and people are like, "Are you sad?" I'm like, "Well, I'm getting kicked out of all the like cool kids groups on Facebook, but in the Presbyterian Church USA, of course, we are forever
Yeah.
young." So
Sadly, if you need to feel young, go to many of our churches.
go
Yes,
to our churches.
exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for the book. I really loved it. And I want to start by just giving you a chance to tell us whatever else you want to tell us about you and the book and the why. And then we'll dive into some conversation about it.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. This is probably, well, not probably, this is easily the most audacious project I've ever taken on. When Broadleaf, the publisher, invited me, basically the pitch was we can't really write or read another book on deconstruction. So, and it wasn't a dig on that process for people, which I think is important, but it was like that market is flooding right now of things. So
Yeah.
what's next? And I had written this kind of faith statement montage before, and one of the editors, the acquisitions editor, picked it up and thought, hey, this could be a book. And I'm like, yeah, I think it might be. And so we had this conversation, and the idea was basically, okay, so write a book on Christianity. It stop, right? And that's accessible, that's
Mm,
not too long, and reflects this integrated, complex theological space that many of us hold. And so I tried, and the first draft was I think 70,000 words or something, and then we had to get it down to 70,000. But I really wrote it with generally not a particular target in mind. So sometimes like, were you writing this for post-evangelicals, people who are leaving the church? Are you writing it for, whatever? And I'm like, I actually think this is gonna touch a lot of different people. If I had to choose who I was really writing it for, I was a church planter for 15 years, and I always wanted something that I could hand to people who were really seeking and thinking about Christianity without having to give many disclaimers, because usually it was like, well, this is really conservative, this is, or not conservative, this is academic, or this is written out of a kind
mhm.
of a white male cisgendered experience, this one doesn't have a lot of social justice, and I'm hoping to provide something that you don't have to give those disclaimers. There'll be some for everyone, but for the most part, wanted just to say, here's something you can pick up and get this huge breadth of a version of the Christian faith. Well, and
Yeah.
I will say, especially because there are so terrible versions out right now that are getting most of the airwaves, and we've abdicated that space, and now we need to try to, I don't know if we're saying reclaim it, but just take a seat in those spaces in a more meaningful way. So I'm hoping this will help.
Yeah, and I think that's like a huge issue in our congregations because when you talk to the average Presbyterian, they will say things like, "Yeah, that sort of very conservative, xenophobic, Christian nationalist version of Christianity isn't us, but they don't know how to describe
Hmm.
who we are, or they don't know
Yeah.
how to tell about their faith. And so one of the things I was wondering about as I was reading this, especially with some of the questions at the end of the chapters, is if you could think about sort of the average liberalish Presbyterian church, that's they're sort of in that deconstruction space, but not in the other deconstruction space, right?
Yeah.
How would
Yeah.
they, how do you like kind of hope they could use that book, not
Well,
necessarily to deepen faith, but like figure out how they like talk about it,
yeah, well,
right?
I think that's very much it, right? I think we've
Yeah.
lost an ability to articulate our faith in a way that is meaningful. I think we've
Yeah.
gotten extremely lazy and arrogant about
Hmm.
our faith. Like it's so good, you should just be able to figure it out and find it, and we don't need
Yes.
to tell you about it.
Yeah.
Like that, and I that has led to that's not the only reason they're in decline, but that's a significant reason
Yeah.
we've lost people when they leave an evangelical space. They come to us, and we're not any more clear about things. In fact, we're like almost smug about where they used to be. And aren't you good now you found us? But we don't actually give them anything to
Hmm.
ground that in because we don't know. I think a lot of our pastors aren't able to really articulate what do you believe about Jesus? Because I
Yeah.
think we're our only like we're always creating ourselves in opposition to.
Hmm.
And what I'm trying to do in this book is say, no, 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 no. We'll acknowledge that there's things we're in opposition to, but our faith can't be built on what we're not. Otherwise, that just goes away as soon as that opposition goes away. So I'm hoping that this will re-inspire people to think about their faith in a way that's what I choose to believe versus what I'm forced to believe because I don't like the other thing. And
Right.
that's where I think it hopefully will touch upon a lot of different people's perspectives.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, that's, I mean, that's that deconstruction for our more mainline progressive, however you want to describe it, is really deconstructing how we've talked about faith and rebuilding up a more positive, life-giving way of doing it.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I almost handed your book to someone Saturday, so I'll tell you what happened briefly. So we, as you know, we have an African American congregation in our presbytery that had an arson, a hate crime 3 years ago, and the church was burned down. And we've been in the process of rebuilding and working with the church. And this weekend we happened, they were throwing a huge gala on Saturday night and a couple hundred people, big event. And so I was at the nail salon at 10 a.m. on Saturday getting my nails done before I went to this, fancy event. And I'm sitting in the nail salon after I got my nails done at the dryer, and you have your hands
Right,
in
right.
the air, and I'm sitting there and there's, some other people around me. And this woman across the dryer from me, she's also got her hands in, right? And she says, "Oh, I really like the color of your nails." And typically I'm sort of in this kind of Zen space when I'm doing something like that. Like I don't really want to talk to anybody because I spend all my
Right.
time talking to people. But for some reason, I really wanted to talk to her. And I said, "Oh, thank you. I'm going to a party tonight." And she said, "Oh, tell me about it." So I told her the story quickly of the church and what had happened. She quickly surmised I was a minister. I explained my role. And she said to me, she said, "Oh my gosh," she goes, "my husband and I have lived here for years and we have not been able to find a church. Where do you go to church when you're not working on
Mm,
Sundays?" And I was really glad because I was able to tell her about First Presbyterian here in Albany, which is a historic, like 25 plus year more light church, very progressive, involved in the Poor People's Campaign and just all sorts of really good street cred and also just a really deeply spiritual, intentional space. And she was like really looking for a church and said she told me some of the stories of some of the places she and her husband had been. And I was
no.
halfway through your book in preparation for today. And so selfishly, I was like, I got to keep the book for me because I'm talking to Bruce on Monday. But I almost like pulled it out of my purse to hand it to her because I was carrying it around in my purse, reading it where I had pockets of time the last few days. And and I thought to myself, am I one of these people who like hands out like tracts to people? Is Bruce's book like
What has happened? What's going on?
is this like my new tract or something? But I almost gave it away. And you say in the book you don't like that word, like you're sort of like breaking up with the word evangelism. But I felt like I was having one of these
Yeah.
evangelistic moments, which does feel a little bit out of skin for me. But I also feel like more and more these days, I'm more like, I'm going to tell you what I'm about and who I am. Because so much of the time it was like, definitely growing up in like the white, really literally like the mainline church on the main line of Philadelphia, like the
Right.
message I got as a kid was like, we don't talk about like, religion and politics,
Right.
in polite company. But she was like ready for the conversation
Yeah.
and excited.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so the way that I talk about in the book a little bit is I just don't put any energy in trying to capture the word event. I've heard people preach like we need to recapture the word, and I'm like, that word is no longer ours. Like there is nothing we are going to be able to do to have the world when they hear evangelism think of progressive Christianity. Like it's just not going to happen. So I'm like, so what does evangelism then look like for every person? And most of them are just like you said, right? I love when I meet with people and they're like, well, we don't want to be like too evangelical. And I'm like, well, if your only understanding of what it means to share your faith is a cold call in a cafe asking somebody if Jesus Christ is the Lord and Savior,
Yeah.
that then yes, don't do that. But I don't actually think most of us that's our go-to. But I think it's a cop out in many
Mm.
ways to say that's what it looks like rather than taking these opportunities when there's like we've been at this for a long time as pastors, and I think most of the time if folks find out that we are connected to the church, there's curiosity, there's like, I mean, it's just not because we're relying on relationships already, and I would tell folks just rely on the relationships you already have. And I almost can guarantee you that you talk about your faith and folks are going to either have like, oh, that's interesting affirmation, or there's going to be a curiosity. And that's what then evangelism looks like for in a different way. But I think people are even scared of doing that because they're
Yeah.
worried about what they may be perceived as.
Yeah, and I think we have these like soft opportunities that come to us all the time, like what
Oh, yeah.
happened to me on Saturday. And it's just grabbing them and using them. And I worshiped with our MLK congregation yesterday, stayed over, was with them. They had, lots more people in worship with them after this gala on Saturday night. And I told them the story. And I said, if I had been in this zone of the presbytery when this happened, I would have told them about your church, right? Like,
Right.
I love that I have churches when I run into people, like that's who we are as Presbyterians. And so I was able then to like re-remind the church yesterday in worship that even though this isn't a couple that's going to show up at their place, it's also like this is our brand and we should live into what our brand is as Presbyterians.
Yeah.
It shows up in different ways in different local churches, but our brand is like we are the open, welcoming space. Our brand is we're the curious space, and we also get serious about real world issues.
Yeah.
And so it was fun. Like they really enjoyed the story yesterday, but they also were like, yeah, that's who we are. We should do more of that. So I think to
Yeah.
keep reminding congregations, like get outside of yourself a little bit more and use those everyday opportunities to chat with people about who
Yeah.
you
Yeah. I mean,
are.
I think, I mean, that whole, like, we don't want to become kind of saviorism kind of people, like, but at
Right.
the same time, when we abdicate that space, we're allowing dangerous theology to take it.
Mhm.
And so, I think we just have to find that sweet spot without, moving into this kind of more arrogant kind of savior space, but claiming a truth that we believe to be true. And I think we've lost the will and the courage to do that.
Yeah.
So
And you wrote this book. You probably started it a little post-pandemic or during the pandemic, but certainly we've been in this, space in the United States where Christian nationalism has really been creeping in. And I think it's even in our, tried and true Presbyterian churches in soft ways, like the flag in the sanctuary
mhm.
that's the third rail that you can't take out. And you know, somebody getting mad because you don't do patriotic hymns on certain, days of the
Yeah.
year, things like this. But, what do you want to say about Christian nationalism and where it is today and where we're doing a good job as Presbyterians around that and where we have to really like step up our game fast?
Yeah. I mean, I think you just hit on, I mean, you're obviously working with pastors in these spaces that
Yeah.
those kind of subtle ways that we reinforce the idea, because we can all say, well, we're not participating in insurrection, so we're clearly not
Hope not.
there. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm sure there were some, but right. So we're like it. So that's almost easy, like that dramatic thing. I'm not doing that. Like I'm
Mm.
not participating in slavery today. But then, how do you look at all these systematic? I mean, part of what I try to do in the book is blend, not try to kind of bifurcate individual and communal both sin and affirmation, and to kind of see these as, there is, progressives, we poo-poo the personal relationship with Jesus Christ. That side may poo-poo this kind of communal relationship. And like I just have lived, I grew up with both, and so and I think that's how we look into things like Christian nationalism, is we look at our own individual, how do we participate, how do we reinforce, and then what is the system? What are the systems that we participate in that reinforce this idea? I mean, we look what's happening in Gaza and Palestine right now. And how are we speaking out against our own government, against many Christians who are very supportive of what the government of Israel is doing. And like that's another space where you can abdicate that space, you can be silent in that, but by doing so, you are subtly affirming what is happening, especially right now in this particular instance that is so obvious and kind of visible to the world. So I think part of it is understanding how we individually participate in these systems, how we need to be aware of that and confess that and lament and find healing, and then how we participate in the bigger system of some of these things that reinforce this Christian nationalism that we would easily like to say, well, we don't do all the terrible things, but we subtly do. I mean, and that's the thing I love about this tradition, not just us as Presbyterians, but kind of this mainline, really thoughtful, like how do we blend this thinking, heart, soul, creativity, all of that into figuring out what we're going to do. Other places, here's the answer.
Yeah.
I actually find great security in knowing that there's a multiple ways to get to a common place. So that's anyway, that's
Yeah,
where we're
God
at.
is mystery and the Reformed tradition has always been one of the
Yep.
things that's like really rung all the bells for me in faith.
Yeah.
It's been
Yeah, in other traditions, it's manipulative, right? It's only God is only mysterious when we don't like what's happening or it doesn't make sense to us. But in other places, for more like God says these 10 things and you better believe them. And I'm
right.
like, oh. And
Yeah,
what I'm trying to say and what I think we believe, like, no, actually, God is a mystery in all of these components. We land in moments and we take off again, and and there's great security in that and
exactly.
comfort in that. So.
Right. Right. And I think on the piece on, Christian nationalism and where we are in the church, years ago, I had a person who was coaching me as a clergy coach. And I was working in a system in the church that was really, really dysfunctional, like dysfunction on steroids. And I was having a hard time finding my way in it and also getting a lot of messaging of like, Shannan, keep your mouth shut. Shannan, don't say anything in this space. Good leadership in this space is like completely neutral centric leadership, which, as you know, is not really my style. And so I was really struggling in this space, but I was also getting like a lot of threats because of that, because I wasn't sort of, doing what I was supposed to do. And my coach said something to me, which is really, really stuck with me. And I share this with clergy when they feel stuck in, where they are. And she said to me, she said, Shannan, she said, there's more people in the system that want it to be functional, but they're afraid to say anything. And so once they see someone say something and someone be brave in public,
Yep.
some of them are going to start to step up, but they need like a catalyst. They can't do it on their own. And so unfortunately, some of what your role is in the system is to be the catalyst.
Mhm.
And that was really extremely true advice. And I've given that advice to other people. And I wonder if that's the advice, I think it is for us. We're living in an incredibly dysfunctional system in our denomination to a degree these days. And our country is certainly a dysfunctional situation these days. I don't know how much more dysfunctional it could be. It's embarrassing on a regular basis.
The
And
sad part is it probably could become more like it's
yeah,
just
I
like
know. I know. We went home for Christmas and I knew all of Juan's family when we were home for Columbia for Christmas were going to be like, so Shannan, what's up?
oh yeah. We traveled to Australia this past summer and that was like the first question, like, is it as wild as we're hearing? And I'm like, yeah.
Yeah. And people would be like, Shannan, explain to me what happened to you guys. I'm like, I don't know.
I
I
don't
can't.
know.
But I also think like some of our role as leaders, right, is to be those like clear people in systems. So you
Yeah.
and I've chatted about this a little bit on social media. I write this letter to our presbytery once a month, and it's really meant to be like theological, like a theological grounding. And sometimes I'll do themes during liturgical seasons, and sometimes I'll just write about pieces. And I've been pretty clear on the Israel-Palestine
Mhm.
situation and what's going on in Gaza, the war, the genocide, been using words like that, genocide, which I have gotten some feedback, as you can imagine,
Sure.
on. But I've also said, like, I've been clear since day one, like, I'm going to be a clear person. You don't have to agree with me. I'd love to be in dialogue with you,
Right.
but um, I also think it's important to say who we are. And then sometimes we have these really awful situations that happen. I'll put out a special one. And I have clergy say to me all the time, Shannan, thank you, because I couldn't find words for worship and I didn't know what to say. And so this prayer you wrote or this thing you wrote, I actually used some of it. I think we're like struggling for imagination. We're both like wanting to speak in the dysfunction, and we're also somehow so overwhelmed by it. We're stuck and almost muted.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of, we're sort of, I see a lot of clergy as stuck between those places. I'm not saying this is a judgment with our
Mhm.
colleagues, but I feel like there's just we're just in this really weird space these days. And then of
Yeah.
course, there's all these worries about like, will I get fired? And then will I ever
Mhm.
find another job? And the economic pressure is real,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. No, I think I mean, that's super real. I mean, I really come out, and I'm one of those that we need all strategies for movement, right? Some are just going to be like, I think I said at some point, like I'm much more activist than some and far less than many more. And
Right.
so everybody has some space, and there are people that early on, right? If you're not speaking out now, then you are already like, and really challenging people that if you're and I've tried to be in a little more pastoral space with my colleagues and friends. Like, I get it. Like, I know, but at some point you got to make the choice. Like at some point,
Right.
but I'm still reaching the point now. I'm like, there's been, pardon the military kind of illustration, but like enough cover has now been laid for most of our people that there
Yeah.
is no excuse now. Like, I don't get it.
Yeah.
And every incident that happens that we hear about, certainly that's the tipping point for some of our folks. Surely that's got to be.
Right.
And so now I'm at that point where there are enough people that are, I mean, the Council of Bishops just called for a ceasefire. I mean, so now you have major institutions who are finally coming to this place where many people have been early on. 5 months later, I kind of feel like now our colleagues, yeah, like people have taken the risk for you, and
Mhm.
now it's time. Like you got to get out there and say something so your people can begin to understand why they also should help public witness. I mean, I just was there, and
Yeah, talk about the delegation some. I want to give you some space. I know it's not
yeah,
in the book, but the delegation was so important, and um, I'm really glad all of you went, and I would love to just give you some space to chat about it because I think part of what you all are going to do now, right, is tell the story of what you saw, and I think that's super important. So
yeah, I'll
hopefully that
I can be really quick on this. I mean, so a group of us went, 34 of us, invited by Sabeel and Kairos Palestine, who are unapologetically Christian Liberation Palestinian organization. So
right,
we're not there under any guise of fair and balanced and trying to hear all that kind of stuff. We did hear from a family of hostages, and that was very controversial, and that's another thing. Three
yeah,
takeaways from the trip. One is that there's, Palestinian Christians are not being persecuted. I've heard this kind of narrative that they're persecuted there, which is not true, but are struggling because their population is going down. There are no more, apparently, houses of worship are no longer sacred to anyone. And so Palestinian Christians are starting to leave. And there's big concern about a huge number like that population and demographic just being gone. Certainly, some are going to say.
mhm,
The second thing is that there is an eerie silence in the West Bank, in
yes,
we're in Ramallah, but also in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Eerie silence, for two reasons. One, that um, many folks told us that because the world has allowed the state of Israel to do what they've done and are doing in Gaza, that what the West Bank is next.
yeah,
And you're seeing it happen. The acceleration of home demolitions and displacement strategies are ever increasing. So that's the second thing, is that folks are earlier. The third, which is I think is the most important, we met with the mayor of Bethlehem, and he said to us basically, the solidarity is great. Thank you for being here. But unless things change, it doesn't really matter. Like
Mhm.
unless public opinion changes that sways your governments, if they're still participating in this, it actually doesn't matter.
Right.
And then so for me, it's like, okay, so what does our advocacy mean if it doesn't lead to anything? So how do we make sure and figure out a way that our advocacy is done in the right way in the right places so that it actually shifts policy? And that those, I mean, those are by far, well, actually, there's one more that I did one presentation so far is that
Yeah, go for it.
almost every presentation that we heard, interaction we had, no matter who was with, they always ended with, but we're still hopeful. And,
Mm.
have every right not to be.
Yeah.
But they're like, we're going to be here. We're not leaving. We still believe, even though maybe we shouldn't, that this can change. And I'm like, all right, okay. If you can do it, who are we to come back and say it's all over? So I think that that's part of what, the solidarity is great, the activism is great, but if it's not pushing towards something and we don't move it, it doesn't matter. And that if they can have hope about it, then we can be motivated by that as well. So, trying to figure out as we're navigating life and everything else going on, how do you keep pushing out and educating, and so that's what most of us are doing. We're actually having a call right after this recording, actually, with our group to check in and figure out what we're doing next. So
Figure out what's next
yeah,
on all
yeah,
those fronts.
yeah.
How was your soul on that trip? Like how did you navigate that trip spiritually, and how did you notice others did?
Yeah, I think so we had folks who had family there who were on this trip,
Mhm.
and that was a different space for them. Many of us, I think all but two of us had been there before, so it was kind of a veterans kind of group. So we had to actually check ourselves a little bit to see how much we were assuming about what we knew already or thought we knew. And so that was one. I think for many of us, there was a little bit of there was a little relief of kind of being back in a space that we have great solidarity with. I think that for if anybody has, been there, it's an intellectual exercise until you visit,
Yeah.
and then it changes your life and your perspective about the Holy Lands, right? I mean, it just changes
Mhm.
everything. And so I think there was a visceral reconnect that was for many of us who were there. And then, I think uh, there were a couple of times I think the group wanted to be more active and save something. And, that's a natural thing. And we didn't. And I think we all checked ourselves. But I think that was like wanting to be able to do something tangible when there was nothing really we could
Yeah.
do. I mean, I think that was a difficult, and trusting our leaders, our Palestinian leaders, where we should and should not go. We were going to go to Jenin, and then the night before we were going to go, there was bombing, and so they said we're not going to take you there. And I think we all were like, okay, fine, we'll trust you. So
Mhm.
I think it was heavy, but because many of us have been there, and just the vibe
Right.
everywhere was so heavy. Uh, but talking with and because everybody we talked to in the West Bank just were like, we're not ignoring Gaza, but Gaza is done.
Mm.
It's happened. Uh, and and we're next, and what are we gonna do? That part
We preserve a little bit of this. Yeah.
weighed, and it's like this is where our opportunity to change things is to save the West Bank. And
Mm.
then but always the hopeful part was always everyone. Like, we're still hopeful. We're not going anywhere. Here we go. I'm like, okay, all right. So I think it was a definitely an ebb and flow. This is a group that was pretty experienced here in terms of trying to figure out how to process our own stuff without doing it with the people we were trying to interact with. And yeah, so I got back, had to present immediately. And so it's still taking a little bit of figuring out what does it look like to hold that space and life here, and what's the right balance. And I got a book coming out. Like, it's just
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
meaningfulness of this book right now is so low in the scheme of the world, but also really important to me, and what I think there's some goodness about it. So trying to, like, everybody should be trying to figure out that tension
Well, I
in their
think,
life.
I mean, it is, putting it in its place, right? It's a
Yep.
book, but you also wrote a book, which is amazing, right? I mean, so we want to celebrate that and celebrate you, but
On
also
Christianity, no less.
on Christianity. I mean, what a topic. But at the same time, like, if not now, when, right? Like, we are
Yeah.
in such a moment. And I think, we're in such a moment in the life of the church. Like, who are we? What are we about? How do we actually get serious about our faith?
Mhm.
I think we've been sort of, playing around the edges of it for so long. And the seriousness has always been important. And maybe because we've let it go for so long, now it feels like such huge catch up, but we really do need to be
Yeah.
serious. And now we've got these huge things staring us in the face, like Gaza, like the climate crisis, like, just the abject loss of function in our own country. And people are going, and, and we survived a pandemic, which we barely have started to process.
Right. Yeah.
Um, all the things,
All the things.
people are feeling overwhelmed. I think, when you talk about folks in, sort of Presbyterian mainline churches going, oh my God, there's so much on our plate, but there's always been so much on our plate. We've just had the privilege of ignoring it
Yeah. Yeah.
so long. And, here we are. We got to really, deal with
Well,
it
and
as a
denominationally, we've been able to put our energy in fighting things and fighting
right.
for things, which is great. But now, can we be who are we without fighting each other?
Hmm. Yeah, now's the time to dig in and actually do
Yeah.
work. We spent so much time on the fight. We never dug in and did the work alongside it. So
Yeah.
I, it's going to be, there's some winnowing that's going to happen. I mean, we're in that winnowing moment, but I think we're also in that moment where really interesting new stuff is getting
Oh
birthed
yeah.
inside it. And that's where I think something like, what you've put pen to paper with in this book can be really helpful as people sort of recheck back in on who they are and realize it doesn't have to be, like you said, one of these big theological treatises, and it doesn't have to be written by a PhD. It can be really, truly as simple as this is my personal confession of faith. This is who I am, and this is why, and encouraging people to write
Yeah.
that and giving them practices to either write or describe or draw that as you go through the book. The other thing I thought was so interesting, and I think this is some of the winnowing we're in right now, is you said, you talk about we don't need a church building to know God. And I was reading something, I cannot remember who, from another source. Oh, it was Victoria Loors in a podcast that she did, who's written the book Wild Church, which is all about,
Yeah.
outside. And
Yes.
she, in seminary, we're educated on how to get people inside a building and keep them there.
Right.
And then the pandemic threw us all outside. And then as soon as the pandemic was quote unquote over, right, we like scurried back into our buildings.
Yeah.
Uh, but the real ministry is really outside. And I say this to people sometimes, like, Jesus never built a building. Did you notice that in the Gospels? Like, Jesus never constructed a building. He
Yeah.
went in occasionally, very episodically, but he spent most of his time outside. And when I say that to people, they go, "Oh yeah, I like kind of hadn't thought about it that way. Like it's
Yeah.
like a revelation or something when it's just plainly right there." So
But
buildings and
yeah. And
you
I was
know,
saying Jesus hung out in like third spaces all the time.
all the
Eh,
time.
Right.
Yeah.
And so if your building is a third space, great. But
Awesome.
if it's the only space that has a set of rules and regulations about how you can be in it, that's where the problems come.
Right.
Right. Like so it's right. So it's buildings are great if they're used well, but if they become kind of the gatekeeper in itself, like was just talking with somebody about a particular church, and they're like, "Well, I'm really creative about this and da da da, but this is never going to happen in my sanctuary, like whatever it is." I'm like, "So you're not actually as open
Right.
as you might think." Like, huh? I'm like, at least own it, like just
Yeah.
be. But yeah, no, I think that's part of it is having creative understandings of what church can look like
Hmm.
without because I do think the other part that's really difficult is when folks will say, well, worship doesn't mean anything anymore. We don't want people like that. And I just like, well,
Hmm.
done well, worship is incredibly important, and that has to happen somewhere, whether it's a building or it's the wild church. I'm not sure I could do it because they meet outside no matter what. like like no matter what. I'm like, oh, it's snowing. I'm not going to church. Like, it's not that is not happening. We need a building. That'd be my first like
When I served Albany Presbytery, we had a pastor who was at a small church, and she was like barely quarter time, and she spent the rest of her time as a ski instructor and in the summers as a whitewater rafting instructor. So she was like a real outdoorsy person. And so she started a new worshiping community because she met all these people on the ski slopes, talking to them in, these third
Yeah.
spaces, like, the nail salon, the coffee shop. And it's like the ski lift and the raft were like her third spaces. And she met all these people that really wanted a connection. So she started an outdoor church before there was sort of language for this.
Right.
In their first meeting, I went to it and I had my biggest puffy jacket on, which makes it look like I've gained like 50 pounds, right? And it's like, and
It's
I
like
had
Christmas story.
I'm walking
Of
like this, like I'm like, and it was on a yurt on the side of Gore Mountain.
course.
It was like about maybe 2 degrees above zero, maybe. And they had this blazing fire and they had hot chocolate outside in the freezing cold. And then they went into the yurt and had church. And I drove up there with like my snow tires and everything. And I mean, they were making it happen, but it's a commitment.
Well, okay, so that's a building, right? So at least there's a yurt you're walking into. I mean, in some of these places, these wild churches, I was doing
I know.
coaching with one in Canada, and they're like, no, doesn't matter. We circle up, and I'm like, you all are better Christians than I. That's what I was going like. That is not. Jesus is going to forgive me for not going to church in the
Yeah.
snow. I'm from
Now, on the
California.
other, like the other extreme of this, right? The other side of this binary, right, is that, we have churches that are choosing their buildings over having ministry leaders,
No,
right?
that's true too. Yeah,
And then you don't have someone to help you, be that sort of coach and guide. Not that you need a pastor for everything
right,
either,
right,
but the buildings have become idols to a
right. So,
degree.
do you have in your area churches that can survive on the endowment and don't need members?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so that has not quite happened on the West Coast because they're not as old. They don't
right.
just don't have the same kind of, but you hear
Well,
about these places like we don't actually need anybody to come here. The church is going to be fine. The
sure.
church, which the building is going to be fine. I'm like, okay, well,
Yeah.
that's one way to go, I guess. That's a choice.
It's a choice. It's an interesting choice.
This
We
is
have a
it.
lot, it's interesting because in New England, of course, the UCC is the
Right.
big fish. They have the old buildings. We don't have as many in my presbytery, but we do have some churches that have, big endowments. They're, if you're listening to this, I'm not judging you. And but with endowments, but it is hard, and churches get to that space, right, where their congregations, not churches, I should say,
Yeah.
congregations get to that space where they're trying to decide on ministry, but they also love the building. And then I hear people say things to me like, Shannan, I wonder if we let go of the building or downsize to a smaller building, like sold this and move somewhere else in the community, would people still give? And like a real sense that people won't give if they're not in that building. And that the building is
Interesting.
a bigger draw for giving than the actual ministry. And that's when I get worried. That's when I
Right.
get
Well,
worried.
then you're no longer, I mean, I'll judge. You're no longer church.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard.
Right.
Hard
Because
stuff.
I just am always like if you are doing meaningful ministry, people will give. Young people will give
Yes.
if there is
Yes.
meaning to it. And I think folks just don't believe it and it's to their own detriment. And so, I think that if you're listening and you're thinking young people won't give, that is not true. It just means that you haven't figured out the meaningful ways to draw in their energy, their time, their resources, because they will. I mean, I've done it in a couple of churches and seen it, and I mean,
Yeah.
it
I've
can
seen it.
happen.
Yeah. It can
Yeah.
happen.
So,
Yeah, there's somehow this sort of stuckness there. So,
yeah.
so a few more things before we close up, I
Yep.
wanted to hit on. One is this role of confession. So back in the olden days when I was in seminary, I served at a Methodist church for 2 years, and so when they had lots of seminarians. So when you preach, the senior pastor had this thing like you were thrown into the deep end of the pool. You had to do your own thing, and I had to write my own liturgy. And the church secretary was another dyed-in-the-wool Methodist. Again, no shade to the
Yeah. Yeah.
Methodists. I do appreciate them deeply. And she was like, Shannan, I always know when you are preaching because you insist on having a prayer of confession in the bulletin. And it's so long and it's so detailed.
It's so long.
And it really wasn't that long. It was like four
Yeah.
sentences. Right.
Yeah.
And I was like, I used to say to her, I was like, Connie, I don't know how to like have church without having confession. So I'm
Yeah.
glad you wrote about confession because it's always like I really had to defend
Yeah.
my confessional nature because I
Yeah.
was with the Methodists, and then
Well,
they would there's Sundays they're like, you just make us feel so sad, Shannan.
oh my gosh. I mean, I think that's the part is like we haven't figured out one how to do it well with or without words. I mean, I think
Hmm.
that's one of the pieces that I go in. And I go into some of these churches and guest preach, and I read these confessions. I'm like, oh, good Lord, how long it is too long. I'm like, how can't we be more creative with how we
Yeah.
invite people into understanding how we might have turned away from what God intends? And that the other part is we have forgotten how to explain what we're doing in a way that helps people understand why we do it. Because if you just see confession and then these things, and yeah, oh, so this is where we feel guilty about what we're doing, and then this is the part where, but as opposed to, every service needs to be like, we have confession now because this is the time where we acknowledge that sometimes we turn away from what God intends for us. And we're just going to name these things together. You may not be you, but somebody, we hold these all together. And then now we're going to I think part of it is we have that it's that, I would say, laziness in some ways, or that's probably a little strong, but we've learned faith by osmosis. So we think that's how we learn it. And we have to be more direct, more creative. And confessions, I agree with you. I just feel like, how do you get to understand how you need to continue to live and change in order to grow closer to who God intends you to become without like, gosh, you're such a terrible person, change now or burn in hell,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there are middle spaces. Like
Right.
you can find.
Yeah. And I had never really like realized how important it was to me or how much I had to defend it until she sort of teased me about it, and she really wasn't like
Right.
upset.
Yeah.
She
Yeah.
was more like just giving me a hard time. Um, but I realized then like, oh, this is like really very important to me. And it's always been really important to me. And I
Yeah.
didn't realize how much that, and also that consistency of being in worship as a child and a young adult and a teenager, like how it had really crept into me, and I didn't need to be taught that liturgical practice or even how to do it in seminary because it was just second nature,
Right.
and helped me feel like secure in worship,
Right.
and also secure in just that like examine process, which is really an ancient process and very important. So
Right.
I'm glad you put a plug in for
Oh,
confession.
good.
So glad. So one more just to sort
Yep.
of hit up before we go, and we were going to talk a little bit about creativity, but we're running out of time. But that goes with mystery. But I do want to, hit that piece you talked about around humility and how that has to do so much with colonialism for
Hmm.
you, and to talk a little bit about this connection. Our presbytery has been doing some really good work with Jessica Vasquez Torres and the good folks at Crossroads. Still very much on our journey, right, as a presbytery community around these issues. But
Yep.
just wondering if you want to say a bit about that.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we tend to do, and I don't know who even the we is, but
Mm,
we go to the extremes.
yeah.
So to be humble means you never speak your truth. Well, that's not true, right? Or it means that if you speak your truth, then you're being arrogant and you're too prideful. And I'm like, well, that's not true either. And I think so. Part of it is figuring out how we can speak our truth without assuming that it is everybody's truth,
Hmm.
so that we're not bringing that into a space as if it is the answer. I think one of the most dangerous words in the English language is the, because it often says, it like the church. Well, we're not, there's no one church, right? It's or the gospel, as opposed to, well, no, it's really a version of the gospel. I mean, so I think that part of the humility is understanding that because I experience it, because I may think it, doesn't mean that that is everybody's experience and what they may be thinking. And that shouldn't stop me from sharing what I believe. In fact, it should give me permission to share it and to hear others
Hmm.
in the same vein. Now, there are always going to be people that believe that what they believe and their experience should be the centered one. But I think that's where this, colonial mindset, right, comes in, where this is the centered experience that everybody must adapt to. It's like,
Right.
no, I actually think there's a bunch of experiences that we're connected to. The center for me would be we're all kind of connected through in this tradition into this Christian space. What does it mean to follow this person that we call Jesus? Like,
Yeah.
and I think we're trying to noodle around that, and we all have spaces, but we get into trouble when we believe we've found the answer, the space.
Right.
And that's really where I hope I kind of talk about humility enough in there around,
Yeah, and
like,
I think
it's,
it's also some of our North American context, right? We think, and for some reason, my printer decided to print a document out of the. I only know why. But in the North American church, I think sometimes we think like the way we do it is the way it is everywhere.
yeah.
when I share with folks, what I experience when I'm not in the United States, like, oh, people do that? Like, really? Like, well, it's not just you. Like, there's all these places
Yeah.
all around the world. Of course, they're culturally different. And so I think we do get into this sort of very myopic mindset, and it is our sort of stuck, entrenched colonial mindset that has been, generationally, pushed into us, where we think this is the only way it is, and we do it right here, of
Yeah.
course,
Yeah. And
right?
then we confine ourselves. What I've noticed is that when your leadership in whatever area of the church invites people to be creative and think about different ways of doing things, I think far and above most people are excited about that. Like if you do it well, folks are like, oh yeah, let's like I don't think we give enough credit sometimes to congregation and members and all that to be flexible. I think we don't always, pastoral leadership don't always do our best at helping people get there. And so how do we develop a way to kind of unleash the creative space from people so that they can experience different ways of doing things that we always thought were the only ways of doing things. And like, well, no. If
Yeah.
anything, pandemic has allowed us and encouraged us to try new things and realize some things were not as important as we thought they were.
Right.
Again,
Right.
you mentioned before we've all tried to go back. Too many places have tried to go back, and I don't think we've examined the impact of pandemic on all of us enough.
Yeah.
But that did show us we actually can be creative and
We can
adapt.
be.
Yeah.
And the church doesn't end just
It
because
doesn't.
being
Yeah.
in the building, we went online, or we went outside, or whatever it is we chose to do in that time. We figured it out. We met new people, and we tried new practices too. We
Yeah.
had to go
Yeah.
parts of our liturgy, all the
Yeah.
things. Well, there's never enough time to talk. I know you've got a next call on organizing on all things related to Gaza and our friends on the West Bank as well. So thank you, Bruce, for all of that work. And I thought as we close, I loved the benediction you offered at the end of your epilogue. And I wonder if you'd read it as we
I yeah,
close
I
up,
could
if
do that.
that would be okay with you.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about this benediction is it has taken it's taken a few changes. I got to get to it. Um, so I used to, there's two lines in here, the hear voices of the long silence and see strength in that which has been deemed weak. It used to be um, hear voices of the no wait, hear voices of the silent, give strength to the weak. And I shifted about I don't know 3 or 4 years ago to like, well then I'm the purveyor of who gets heard or is weak, and so shifted it. So actually now I have to read it before I use it every time in worship because I'm so caught in how I did it for the first like 20 years of my ministry. And now it has changed. So I'll read now. So the benediction, if you ever hear me preach, speak anywhere, I use the same one everywhere. So
Okay, good. So that's important. Go
yeah.
for it.
Go forth into the world with compassion and justice in your hearts. Hear voices of the long silenced. See strength in that which has been deemed weak. See one another, hear one another, care for one another, and love one another. It's all that easy and it's all that hard. May the grace of God, the love of Christ, and the power of the Holy Spirit be with us all now and forevermore. And all God's people say, Amen.
Man. So Bruce's new book, here it is.
And there
Published
it
this
is.
week, right there. Oh, there it is behind you. You're so fancy. You even have one behind you.
For
The
sure.
MSNBC thing. So there it is. Everything good about God is true, choosing faith. I hope folks in our presbytery will pick it up and use it. Thanks, Bruce, for talking with us.
Yeah.
We're so
Thanks for
glad
having
to
me.
have you on our podcast, and have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, bye bye.
Boom. Good.